All right. Hello, I am Charles All, Senior Policy Analyst at the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, and I have with me today Dr. Michael Strain. Dr. Strain is a Senior Fellow, the Director of Economic Policy Studies, and the Arthur F. Burns Scholar in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute. He is also a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion and the author of the book, The American Dream is Not Dead, but Populism Could Kill It. Michael, thank you for taking some time to talk with the Chamber. We really appreciate you being here.
Well, I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. Well, before we jump into some questions about the state of the economy and your book and some of the themes of that book, if you could just take a quick minute and tell us a little bit about AEI and the work that you do there.
Well, AEI is a public policy research institute, a think tank located in Washington. We really kind of cover the gamut. We have scholars who focus on analyzing the economy and economic policy, foreign policy, defense policy, different area experts, Russia, China, Latin America, that sort of thing. We have a really great group of scholars who study education policy issues. We do a lot of political analysis, that sort of stuff. So, issues that are of public policy significance to the country, we're doing longer term, kind of more fundamental research on those issues, and also participating in the day-to-day public debate around them.
Well, great. No, thanks for that summary. AEI is a fantastic organization, and so we appreciate hearing about that. Whenever I get a chance to talk with someone like yourself who spends a lot of their time really digging into the nuts and bolts of the US economy, I like to start with a really complicated and nuanced question, which is generally just, how's the economy going? So that's what I'm going to throw at you now, is just what is your general impression of the current state of the American economy?
Well, the economy is very strong right now. The demand side of the economy is booming. Consumers are spending lots and lots of money as the economy reopens following pandemic-related closures, as people enjoy life after having been vaccinated, able to go into restaurants and travel again, and those sorts of restrictions that governors had put in place during the pandemic have been lifted. Consumer spending is off the charts. Businesses are responding to that by trying to hire workers, and the number of job openings in the economy, for example, is at a record high. Workers are quitting their jobs at record rates, which implies that they have a lot of confidence they'll be able to find a new job that's at least as good, if not better, than the job they have. So the demand side of the economy is really, really doing very well. The supply side of the economy is where there are problems. Some of those problems are with supply chain issues that have arisen because of the pandemic, making it harder for businesses to produce goods and services. There are some significant policy challenges as well. President Biden, as part of the American Rescue Plan, expanded the generosity of unemployment insurance benefits by $300 a week, which is keeping people out of the workforce, keeping them on the sidelines. There are some workers who are still on the sidelines as well due to issues with childcare. Their childcare centers remain closed or operating under limited hours. Summer camps aren't open like they normally would be, these sorts of things. And so there are some really serious factors that are kind of holding the supply side of the economy back. Booming demand, supply that can't keep up, results in higher prices, and we've seen some quite high rates of consumer price inflation. This kind of herky-jerky type economy we've been living in for the past several months is not entirely unexpected. I mean, governors locking down their states, people staying home because of a pandemic, and then that kind of clearing up relatively rapidly. There are going to be fits and starts, and so my expectation is that as we get into September, October, we're going to have kind of smoothed out some of these rough edges on the economy. Demand and supply will be in a better balance, and we will be, hopefully in a pretty good place.
So you mentioned inflation and labor. I want to come back to those in just a second. But first, I want to get your thoughts on the overall government response to the pandemic. I know I've read a little bit of debate going back to 2008, 2009, for example. Some policy observers said there was too little stimulus, and that's one of the reasons perhaps why we had a very slow economic recovery coming out of the previous recession. This most recent recession, we had extensive stimulus, huge levels of stimulus. And perhaps that's why we've seen a more rapid recovery than what we saw back in 2008, 2009. What's your read on that? Did government get the level of stimulus right? Or do you feel like we went a little too far with it?
I think we've gone too far. I think it's important to kind of separate that into the different phases we've been through. So, if you go back to March of 2020, governors just started closing their states, and this is not something that I think was widely anticipated, and that took you know uh, us from a situation where the economy was slowing. Maybe we were looking at a period of negative economic growth into a real catastrophe. Um, During the Great Recession, which began with the 2008 financial crisis, it took 2 years for the unemployment rate to double from 5% to 10%. During the pandemic recession, uh, in 2 months, the unemployment rate went from 3.5%, arguably up to 20%. So this was incredibly sudden, incredibly deep. And Congress came together in March and put together the CARES Act. And the CARES Act contained the Paycheck Protection Program, public health measures, and expansion of the generosity of unemployment benefits, direct payments to households, and other measures. This was signed into law on March 27th, 2020. This did enormous good. It wasn't perfect, but it was remarkably well structured. The amount was a good amount, and it really did, I think, play a substantial role in helping the United States to avert what would have been a decade like the 1920s. A real, the possibility of several years of unemployment in the teens, of the unemployment rate being in the teens was a very real possibility, and the CARES Act played a big role in helping us to avoid that. We had some smaller measures that followed that, and then in December of 2020, President Trump signed a $900 billion stimulus, which contained familiar provisions at that point, and that was really, I think, reasonable, reasonable policy, kind of given what the winter was likely to look like. And the idea was that that would be a bridge to the time when the economy would be reopening and when vaccines would be widely available, and that sort of thing. So, I think that was all appropriate. Standing in January of 2021, you could argue that there were still some needs for fiscal policy to respond to. The economy was looking like it was going to perform, $300 billion short of what it should have done, even given the $900 billion stimulus in December. The $900 billion stimulus uh, omitted some important policy goals like support for state and local governments, things of this nature. And so there was something that some additional fiscal policy support was reasonable. But President Biden pushed through a $1.9 trillion stimulus. And that stimulus, I think, has done more harm than good. By spending that much money, the president pushed the demand side of the economy way too hard. We've seen elevated inflation. As a consequence, the most recent CPI reading was above 5%, for example. That is eroding real gains, right? You know, when wages go up, but prices also go up, purchasing power doesn't go up as much. And households are being hit by higher prices. So yes, they're going out and spending more, but a lot of that spending is just because things are, a lot of the nominal spending, right? The amount of money being spent. Some of that is of course being spent on a greater quantity of goods and services, which is what you want. Some of it is just a reflection of higher prices, which is what you don't want. In addition to the size of the stimulus being too large, the composition, the things that we were actually spending money on were misguided in many cases. The $300 supplement to unemployment benefits that I mentioned earlier, really is holding the economy back, and it's creating price pressures. It's also keeping workers on the sidelines, which is not only bad for the economy, but bad for them. And so, my answer, that's a long answer to your question. And I think the way I would summarize it is that some of the things we did were really good and really smart. We spent a lot of money. Some of the money we spent was great, and we should have spent a lot of money. In March of 2020, facing this unprecedented situation, it was completely appropriate for Congress to spend a lot of money. And the CARES Act passed something like 95 to nothing in the Senate. And there's a reason why it did. As we moved forward through time, I think that we did more than was necessary, and that was counterproductive.
So two follow-up questions before we talk about your book. Let's start with inflation. Here in Kentucky, we do have a lot of businesses and employers that are trying to look into the future and assess what the economy is going to look like over the next few years, and they're thinking heavily about inflation. At a policy level, Kentucky is getting ready to go into a budget cycle. So a lot of our state legislators are thinking intensely about how inflation could play into budget forecasting and things like that. So it's on the minds of a lot of folks here, and I think in really serious ways. It's not just frustrating that I can't go buy a used car or rent a car at a reasonable price right now. Instead, I think it is having really serious implications. What's your read on that? How nervous should we be about long-term inflation, or I guess above what we would anticipate levels of inflation? How concerned should people be about that over the next, say, 2-3 years?
I think it's a risk, for sure, and I think it's a greater risk than it needed to be. If President Biden had a $500 or $600 billion stimulus rather than a $2 trillion stimulus, we would have been able to avoid a lot of these issues. So it's a risk. My base case is that risk doesn't materialize. My base case is that unemployment benefits expire in early September, they won't be renewed. My base case is that schools and daycare centers will be open this fall. That's going to help people come back to work. That's going to reduce wage pressures, which in turn are going to reduce price pressures. Supply chain issues are going to resolve themselves. Consumers are going to pull back. So the supply side of the economy starts to improve. On the demand side of the economy, people are spending a lot of money this summer. Things are finally reopened. People are sitting on quite a bit of excess savings, and they're going to spend some of that but people are going to pull back in the fall, and that's going to kind of come down to earth. So there'll be a rebalancing of supply and demand. My view is also the view of financial markets. If you look at what investors expect, which you can kind of measure by looking at the behavior of the bond market, you see the expectation of investors is that this is not going to be, a kind of sustained wage price spiral that could be really damaging to the economy. Having said that, it's a risk. I'd say there's, I don't know, maybe the likelihood of that happening is around a third, something like that. And so, if there's a 33% chance of rain, you bring an umbrella. And so the risk of this being a prolonged and worsening situation is high and troubling. It's not what I expect will happen, but it's definitely something for the Fed to keep an eye on. And this brings us to another potential danger that Congress and President Biden created by spending so much money. If we start to see that scenario materialize, then the Fed is going to try and slow the economy. The Fed knows how to slow the economy, but typically when the Fed tries to slow the economy, it ends up putting the economy into reverse. And the result of this could be a recession caused by the Fed in order to counteract the demand boom and supply restrictions that to a large extent have been imposed by fiscal policy. That would be bad because recessions are bad, but also because the people who really suffer during a recession are lower wage workers and lower income households. And so the goal for economic policy should be to keep this expansion going as long as possible. And that certainly means supporting the economy when it needs support, but it also means not doing too much. And I worry we've done too much.
Let's talk about the labor market for a quick minute. A lot of the conversations around the labor market right now have been on these sort of acute labor force shortages, which is a very real problem for businesses. I don't want to in any way understate that. That's something we hear about on a very regular basis. But I hear a lot of people talk about, well, eventually the labor market will normalize. I've been spending a lot of time thinking about what that means to normalize in the context of our labor market. And I actually think of a book written by one of your colleagues, Nicholas Eberstadt, about Men Without Work, which traces this long history of the male workforce participation rate in the United States. And it's essentially a plummet over the past several decades. How concerned are you about some of those long-term trends in the US labor market when it comes to things such as workforce participation rate? I guess in your opinion, is getting back to normal, is that overall a good thing for the American economy? Or do you think we need to think more intently or intensely about the overall future of our labor market? Where do you kind of fall in that?
Well, I'm very concerned about long-term trends in male workforce participation. At the same time that men were leaving the workforce, we had women entering the workforce. And so if you look at overall participation in the workforce, it had been going up. But recently, in the last decade or so, women have been leaving the workforce as well, and so our overall rate has been declining. This is a big problem. There are two ways to get your economy to grow. One way is to add workers, and then the second way is to make those workers more productive. And so if we are not going to be able to count on workforce growth, that's going to add to the pressure to get productivity growth up. And that's a really hard thing to do, particularly over a short period of time. So I think policy needs to be extremely focused on figuring out how to get more people to participate in the workforce. And I think that's one of our most important policy challenges.
Let's shift over to your book now. I actually have a copy right here. It's Seen Better Days. It's a little worn at the moment, because it is
Well,
a
that's a good
fantastic
sign.
book. Yeah, no, it's a very, very good book. Um, part of what you're doing with this book is growing to, or is responding to a lot of these critiques of capitalism and free enterprise that are coming from both the left and the right, which you kind of broadly describe as this sort of populist movement. I kind of want to, I know there's a lot of interconnectedness between those arguments on the left, those arguments on the right, but I kind of want to isolate them a little bit and see if we could have you pick them apart individually. So we don't have to go through every single argument, but I was wondering if you could start with what are some of the predominant criticisms of capitalism and free enterprise coming from the left, and how do you respond to those? And then we'll talk about some of those arguments coming from the right. But let's start with more of that left-leaning argument.
So a lot of the arguments are really similar, and this is one of the strange realities of this populist moment. I think historically, for example, the left has been very critical of free trade and very critical of globalization, very eager to embrace protectionism as a way to help workers. And for the 1990s, 2000s, kind of pre-President Trump, the political right really pushed back against that. And if you look at the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, that had a lot of Republican support, signed by President Clinton, a lot of opposition from the left. If you look at the trade expansions in the Bush years, same dynamic. If you look at the TPP trade deal that President Obama was trying to push through, they were really hoping that it was going to be Republicans that were going to get that across the finish line, knowing that Democrats weren't going to be really supportive of it. Now, a lot of the populist right is right there with the progressive left about the dangers as they see them of globalization and of protectionism. You have seen rhetoric on the left about success. Every billionaire is a policy mistake, for example. I think the left is more willing than the right to kind of call out billionaires and make those sorts of very overt and explicit kind of class distinctions. But there are many on the right who are quite critical of Wall Street, quite critical of finance. And so, both the right and the left kind of feature this, the people versus the elites. And I think the left is explicit that the elites include kind of Wall Street and successful people. The right, focuses more on Wall Street and big business. But there's a significant amount of overlap there. So it's getting harder to kind of draw these distinctions. One real distinction that does still remain is on immigration. And so the political right is the populist right is much more hostile toward immigration than the populist left. It's apart from immigration, I think there's an increasing amount of common ground between the kind of populist left and populist right, much more than there used to be.
So if you're talking to somebody on the left who is sort of that persuasion that the American dream is dead and that wages haven't gone up in years and economic mobility is impossible, what is their big policy idea? And how do you respond to that? Or what is one of their big policy ideas?
Well, some big policy ideas are protectionism, that we should have tariffs. President Trump started a trade war with China, raised tariffs on our allies. President Biden hasn't rolled any of that back. Another common policy conclusion is that we should have, Buy America provisions, in both President Trump and President Biden have supported things of that nature. The populist right wants to have immigration restrictions as a way to help native-born workers. There's increasing agreement that government power should be used to break up large companies. And this again, there's a lot of overlap between the populist left and the populist right about the idea that big corporations are to blame for the plight of average workers. And so there are some real ideas out there. There's friendliness toward labor unions and collective bargaining. The left has always been quite supportive of labor unions. You're starting to see the populist right also try and search for policies that would give workers more voice and increase the strength of collective bargaining, even if they're not looking for, even if they're not supporting, kind of traditional labor unions. So, these are some examples.
So I know we're running out of time here. I kind of want to close with just, I guess, a broader question hitting on some of the core themes of your book. But let's say, hypothetically, you're out at a coffee shop and a person maybe you've just met, and they want to talk to you, and they're telling you, from my perspective, the American dream, it's just not a reality anymore. It's not attainable. It's dead. What are the three go-to points that you would want that person to understand, that you would want to make them aware of?
Well, one point that I would make, and I spent a lot of time on this in the book, which I, of course, encourage everybody to buy, and it's a great summer book, a great book for summer. It's also a great book for people who have children who are starting school in the fall, and it's a great book for your friends and neighbors as well. Is that this narrative is just analytically wrong. If you take a hard look at the data, you see that over the last 30 years, wages for typical workers have increased substantially. If you take a hard look at the data, you see that yes, some middle class jobs have disappeared, but others are being created. If you take a hard look at the data, you see that America is still broadly characterized by upward mobility. If you take a hard look at the data, you see that the game isn't rigged against ordinary workers. In fact, ordinary workers have seen substantial benefit from the hot economy that existed prior to the pandemic, and that's also true right now. And so, one big point is that, and again, I spent a lot of time in the book trying to substantiate this, is that the narrative of declinism and the narrative of defeatism that the populist right and left both embrace, I think is just at odds with the facts. The second point is that hard work does pay off, and you can better your circumstances. Again, that's not just happy talk. The data show that that hard work and effort do pay off. And so, part of the American dream is to aspire, to envision a life for yourself, and then to go out and make it happen. And the good news is that in the United States, you can still do that. And so, particularly to young people who are just starting out, I would say, all what you're hearing from the populist left and the populist right, from President Trump and from Bernie Sanders, is that you don't have agency, that you aren't empowered to better your circumstance, that you are a victim, that the system is working against you, that the game is rigged against you. And that's just not the case. If you work hard and you aspire and you play by the rules, the data show that you can better your circumstance, that you can move up the ladder. And I try and show that in the book as well. And so I think it's I mean, there's a lot of data and analysis in the book, but ultimately it's a hopeful message. And but it's not hope for hope's sake. It's hopeful because, in my view, that really is what the evidence points to.
Well, I think that's a good positive note that we can end on. So, Dr. Strain, we greatly appreciate you talking with the Kentucky Chamber, and we appreciate your time.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. It was great to talk with you.